Freedom from Fear, by Elton Gar. Keith took the headset off. As he did, the images, sounds, and smells of the rainforest disappeared, and he found himself back in his room. It was just big enough for his bed and his toilet. The floor stopped moving so he could walk over to the small stand where he put the headset when he wasn't using it. He then opened the narrow door next to it. It led to a 5-foot deep room barely wider than the doorway. His stomach growled, so Keith picked up the small box about halfway down the short room. It was still warm, and he opened it to find a meal. There was no card explaining its nutritional value. He had turned that off a few years ago, since he trusted that his food was safe. Besides, it wasn't as if he was going to override health directives that had kept him safe. That would be almost as insane as going outside. Once inside, Keith sanitized his hands. The food was supposed to be safe, but you didn't stay perfectly healthy by taking that sort of risk. With everything he could sanitized, Keith put the small device next to the food into his nose. It would create the fragrances. He had tried the food twice without it, and it wasn't a mistake he'd make again. Because they didn't have to focus on the taste, the machines that grew the algae focused mostly on texture. Today it was bread, steak, corn, and loaded potatoes. Keith preferred French fries, but rather than saying anything, he adjusted the machine in his nose to make it smell closer to that. While he ate, he looked through his itinerary for the day. He had reserved a drone at a concert. He had only heard a couple of songs from the band, but Jinx and some of his other friends wanted to see it. Then, a couple of hours after that, he had reserved a camera on a submarine near the barrier reef so he could watch fish and listen to music. The drone he logged into at the concert was near one of the speakers, and so Keith lowered the volume on his headset and then began to follow the directions to the small group of drones that were his friends. Weaving through the crowd, he imagined actually being around this many people. He could almost see the germs being passed between them, and as he imagined it, the headset began to adjust to show the bright green colors moving between avatars as they bumped into each other. Of course, no one actually touched. The drones had programs to avoid each other, but the drones treated the overlays as real in every way, even sending haptic feedback to his suit as he pushed his way through. His friends were in a small, perfectly formed circle that expanded as his drone joined it. Their avatars had, at some point, looked like the person who controlled them, but over the years, they had morphed as they added or removed aspects of their appearance. Jinx was the closest to Keith in the circle. That wasn't an accident. She was the member of the group he had the strongest bond with. She had even given him permission to alter the way he saw her avatar beyond the ability to change the overlay of the world. He appreciated the gesture of trust and had given her the same privileges as was customary, but he hadn't changed anything. It wasn't that he was over-attached to appearances. It was that he preferred to see her the way she wanted to be seen. They talked for a few minutes, each relaying the things they had been doing. Emma took up much of that time. She had been volunteering in the war, and because there were always more combat drones than volunteers, she had been thrown directly into battle. The stories explained why it was so hard to get people to volunteer. Since no one was physically in any danger, and the factories made drones fast enough that it would take years to end the war, both sides tried to overwhelm the minds of the drone handlers. Each drone avatar appeared as something that would harm the mind of the pilot. That ranged from making them look like snakes, spiders, and other animals that scared people, to eldritch horrors. Describing them was bad enough that Keith knew he wouldn't be joining the war. By the time she was done describing a battle she had with a drone that had looked like a severed arm, Keith was ready for the music to start so he could think about something else. But it turned out that the band was almost as depressing as Emma's stories, and so halfway through the first song, Keith began to play with his overlays. He picked cartoons from the list and began to search it. Each time he hovered over a choice, the way the world around him looked changed. He started with a Simpsons overlay, then switched to a black and white cartoon from early Disney, before finally settling on a Pixar overlay. It was a bit more realistic than the others, but still cartoon enough to make everything seem brighter and more fun. While Keith was adjusting the audio settings on the overlay, Jinx sent him a private message that said,
"Want to get out of here."
He almost responded that he wanted to stay another 5 minutes because he had found an audio setting that would make the band sound like chipmunks, but he knew Jinx pretty well, and she wouldn't ask him to go somewhere else if she didn't have a reason. Abandoning the drone would allow someone else who cared more about the concert to jump in and watch the rest. And Keith went to where he knew Jinx would be. A few years ago, They had discovered a handful of maintenance bots in a power relay station that had been set to allow people to broadcast into them. Keith didn't know why, but because there was no good reason to take control of a maintenance bot, they were always open, and there was some value in that. He arrived before Jinx and didn't bother to turn off the maintenance bot's functions. Because of that, he was cleaning one of the walls when Jinx appeared. 1 second the drone was there and the next it was Jinx, tall, thin with huge eyes and purple hair. At some point, she must have pre-programmed an outfit for this location because she was also wearing grease-covered overalls, gloves, and boots. He considered changing into something more appropriate for the location as well, but before he had brought up the overlay, Jinx switched to one of her presets. A comfortable-looking dress with a floral pattern. A few seconds later, there was a small pop-up that said he was being sent a custom overlay for this location. He agreed, and as soon as he pushed the button, the area changed. The concrete walls turned into marble, and the other drones became generic people in suits and dresses. There was a table and chairs in the center of the room. It seemed elaborate for somewhere that they mostly just went to avoid other people. But Keith didn't say anything. He had gotten bored and created overlays for places so many times he couldn't keep track of them, and this was better than most of those. Since she had made a table and chairs, he sat in his own chair in the real world as the drone moved to the appropriate location. Jinx sat across from him and said,
"We need to talk."
You said that.
Keith said. He was worried. He didn't think Jinx would break up with him, but he couldn't imagine what else she would need to talk to him about.
Right. Sorry. I've been thinking about this for a while, and I don't really know how to start.
Perhaps we should wait until it's easier.
Keith said. He didn't like to go into any conversation without knowing what was going to happen, and perhaps a delay would allow him time to figure it out.
It will not get any easier. I want to have a child.
Jinx said. Keith felt a small wave of relief as he realized it didn't have anything to do with him. And then he realized she probably wanted him to be involved. He avoided saying anything stupid by being unable to talk for several seconds. Then he got out.
I've never really thought about it. I mean, kids are a lot of work. Can they even wear a headset?
Not until they are at least a couple of years old. I've been doing some research. Almost everyone used to have kids.
Jinx said.
They also drove cars and ate unhealthy food. Do you want to do that too?
Keith said, realizing only after he said it that comparing something she wanted to the stupid things people used to do probably wasn't the best conversational strategy. The image flickered, the drone appearing in front of him for a few seconds, and then Jinx returned. She had taken her headset off. He didn't remember her ever doing that while they were having a conversation.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to imply. I just wasn't ready for this conversation.
Keith said.
You're never ready for anything. Last week you didn't want to go on the mountain hike because you were afraid you might fall off a cliff.
The feedback when a drone is lost really stings.
Keith said.
What about when I suggested we go with Emma to fly drones in the war?
Jinx said.
You were serious about that? They're trying to cause serious psychological harm to you.
Keith said.
And is that why you've never said you love me?
It's a big step.
Keith said, but he knew that wasn't why he hadn't said it. He loved her, but telling her that was scary because he didn't know how she would react.
I love you. And if you want to have a child, I am happy to fill out the forms and send you the correct genetic material.
Keith said. Jinx looked at him for several seconds, and then, without a word, the image disappeared and was replaced by the drone. Keith sat there stunned for several minutes, expecting Jinx to come back. Then he tried to ping her, but there was no answer. So he left her a short message explaining that he hadn't meant to upset her and just wanted to talk. Then he removed his own headset. Standing in his room, Keith felt something he had never felt before. The room felt small and empty. It had always been small and empty, of course, but it had never mattered to him because with the headset, he could go anywhere. He sat in the chair and watched the concrete for several minutes. He traced the flaws in the concrete with his eyes, counted the lines, and finally angrily shoved the headset back on. He looked over the list of open drones and finally picked one. It was on the beach in California. The drone was sitting on a fuzzy beach blanket, and his haptic suit altered itself so that he could feel the warmth of the sun and the fuzziness of the blanket. It even got the feeling of the sand underneath. Instead of enjoying it, Keith just kept looking at the small image in the corner. There were no messages and no sign that Jinx had logged back on. Keith pretended that wasn't bothering him successfully for almost 7 minutes. He then took the helmet off. He considered it for a moment, then asked a question he had never asked before.
Computer, where am I at?
The computer gave a short buzz for several seconds, allowing Keith to know that it was considering his question. It then said,
You are in your apartment. Are you in psychological distress? A drone can be sent to your location with the appropriate medical aid.
The response caught Keith off guard, and for a second he thought that perhaps the devices that monitored his health had seen something. Then he understood. The question was so odd, the computer had taken it as him not knowing he was in his own home, rather than him wanting to know what city he was in. That made some sense. Aside from latency, there was no reason for anyone to care where they were at.
What city am I in?
Keith asked, not bothering to respond to the computer's question. Either it would understand that it had misinterpreted his question, or it would send a medical drone. But right now, Keith didn't care which.
You are in city structure 8021.
The computer said. Keith was so used to the old names for locations that the designation didn't mean anything to him. But it was a beginning, so he said,
Can you tell me the location of Jinx?
Jinx wasn't technically Jinx's name. Her name, like everyone else, was a unique series of symbols, letters and numbers assigned by the computers. But he had saved her name as Jinx, and so the computer knew who he meant.
She was chosen to be introduced to you because she is in the same city structure as you.
The computer said. That was all Keith needed to know. He said,
Have a drone, bring me a mobile computer device.
There was another longer buzzing sound. The computer was programmed to keep him safe, and a mobile computing device's only use was for things that were dangerous. But it also could not deny him any reasonable request or keep him prisoner. So, when it couldn't find any other solution, it said,
A device of that type has to be custom made. It will arrive in 12 hours.
Keith considered that, and even laid on his narrow bed for several minutes, trying to go to sleep to make the time go faster. He couldn't relax, so he stood up and walked over to the short hallway where his things were delivered. On the far side of it was a door that he had never opened. The handle was flat with the door so that it was almost impossible to see, but when he slid his hand along the door, the hinge allowed his fingers to hook under the handle and pull. There was a small click of a latch and the door hung loose. He considered what he would find. He could imagine the many dangers. There could be diseases, wild animals, dangerous edges, even people. And he did not know how he was going to find Jinx or even get back into his home. And for the first time in his life, he was more scared of what he might lose by remaining safe than the dangers. So he took a deep breath of the sterilized and safe air, and then stepped outside of his home for the first time.
Author's note. Safety is something that is often misdefined as a binary thing. That is, in the most literal sense, true. Either you are safe or you are not. But since true safety does not and cannot exist, that leaves the spectrum of safety. What is important about the difference is understanding that the perception of safety is often wrong. Most of us feel more safe getting into our cars and driving to the airport than we do getting on a plane, even though we're far more likely to die on the way to the airport than in a plane. Perhaps the easiest for most people to miss, and the one that is the most important to understand, is that as a whole, we are safer now than we have ever been. On the whole, that's really just saying that life expectancy is up. But there are a million minor ways we're safer. Violent crime rates fluctuate some from year to year, but if you look at it over a reasonable time frame, they have plummeted. Death in war fluctuates as wars end or start, but if you take it as a percentage of population, it's continued to go down. And as recent events have shown, the idea of invading your neighbors has become less acceptable, and because of that, it's more difficult. In the end, safety, like most things, is about balance. People have to take risks. The question is whether the risks you take are worth the reward. The balance between those two is more often based on circumstances than on anything solid. The risk of moving your family to a different country is largely the same for most people. But if the city you're living in becomes a war zone, while the risk of moving may be roughly the same, the risk of staying makes the reward far higher. So while there may be some people who are overly risk-averse, it's usually not by as much as people think, because often what we consider risking everything is different, as is the reward. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, take a tiny risk and sign up for my newsletter. I give away a free short story every week, and you'll get a free ebook for signing up. Or you could take an even bigger risk and become a Patreon and get full access to all the short stories I've written at any level. Elton Gar.